Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for, good morning. Thank you for coming here this Thursday morning in Paris. It's great to be here. I am Park Feierbach. I run the protocol team over at Figment IO. We're a staking as a service provider. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about today about bringing Web2 development trends into Web3 and some ways that we've done it and some things that we think could happen in the future that are kind of like a white space for things that could happen. So a little bit about Figment first. We were founded in 2018. We were a very small team in January of last year, and now we're 240 people. So the bull market was very kind to us. But we were also valued at 1.4 billion as a staking provider, which puts us right at the top of the game in a big way. And that's because we have a strong air of professionalism with a lot of the chains that we support, and we have a broad view of the whole space. So we support more than 60 different networks. We're planning on continuing to do that. We'll hit over 100 at the end of the year. That's a big aim of ours because we aim to support everything that exists in this space. So asking ourselves, like, also, what kind of infrastructure do we provide across different chains? So I had 60 on the last slide. I have 65 on this one. That's because we provide different services to different chains, right? So we support all these different chains. We support RPC endpoint access, and we also support staking services across all of these different chains. So we've gotten through the gamut, a lot of different options that are available to developers for building in the Web3 environment. And so we've experimented with a lot of things. We've tried a lot of things out. Some things haven't worked. Some things have worked. And we're here just to kind of share a little bit more things that we think could work for the future and some observations about people who are coming from Web2 into Web3 and why it is that they kind of want to move over. And the most important thing to keep in mind here is we're focused on time to market implementation because that is a Web2 standard, right? You want to be able to build everything that you have in your implementation with a very short path to actually getting it launched and getting people using it. Otherwise, well, you don't get users. But off the bat, it also just like eases people's familiarity with like the experience of being in Web2. So what are Web2 devs looking for when it comes to coming to Web3? So a big one is what I just already mentioned, right? The user experience of developing in Web2 has gotten to the point where it's almost like an artistic experience for some people. So you can just kind of use a lot of these from building blocks that exist out there, and a lot of it is very reliable. By contrast, Web3 doesn't really have that all that much. We're still building a lot of these pieces. So this is something that we've been very focused on, is we want to be able to build in the direction of reliability, good user experience. And that's a trend we want to see throughout the entire space. And frankly, it's not really there. There's a long way to go, but that's where we're kind of aiming for. The other part that's really important to a lot of Web2 devs that are specifically looking at the advantages of Web3 is that all of the pieces that they have available to them are open-ended and open-sourced with a high degree of integration. And so what that means is in Web3, you are not locked into the platforms that you're working off of. It means that you don't have to operate entirely within a closed framework. And this is a trend we see across the entirety of the Web3 market in all forms of implementation, but especially at the development level. Right? Working off the development level, you want to be able to take the pieces you have, decide what works and what doesn't work, and kind of move across implementations and kind of use the building blocks that are available in a way that in Web2, you were kind of a lot more locked to platforms. And you could have options, but a lot of times the platforms that you'd be building on would be engaging with high switching costs to try to lock you into the experience of operating on there. So Web3, we don't have that trend, so we try to move away from it. And that's definitely a trend that we see with Web2 devs who want to come to Web3 is they want to have the flexibility of implementation as well. They want to have the ability to integrate quickly. So a lot of that is, and this is a Web2 trend that we want to see in Web3, we don't really see it, is good documentation so that you can really exert the full potential of the tools that you're trying to use. That's another trend that obviously it's a problem that has to do with the youth of this market, is that documentation is not usually always up to date. But that is something that is very useful to devs, is being able to actually understand how to troubleshoot the things you're working on, but as well also just creating a better aggregation of tool utility. So what I mean by that, that sounds like a very buzzwordy thing to say, but aggregation of tool utility means can you show other pieces of the stack that work with what you have, even if they're not yours? Now that's not something you really saw in Web2 all that often. A lot of times it'd be like these one-to-one relationships. You'd be like, you create a compatibility matrix with a single piece, and then you'd be locked into that relationship as well. So in Web3, a lot of times they want a simplification of implementation and a flexibility of implementation. So the core thing that Web2 devs really are looking for is this like stackability, forkability, and composability with the open source code that they're engaging with. That means they want to be able to take all the different pieces of the stack and put them together however they want. And this is what affords that free flexibility in how it is that you're building. If you don't like the way something's built, you can take the code, fork it, and make your own version. That's something that in Web2, traditionally in closed source software has been very difficult. With open source software, it has become like a lot easier to do, right? It's not necessarily exclusively a Web3 trend, but in Web3, it's a core premise of the work that we're doing. And so that's something that Web2 devs are really looking for is your implementation open source? Do you have the ability to sort of plug and play it into a bunch of other pieces? And is it something that, that you can use widely across all the different platforms you want to use? And so the key thing here to really keep in mind is this last statement here. Working with Web3 building blocks means you're building with protocols, not platforms. So the key term there is understanding what a protocol is. So what does it mean to build with protocols? Protocols are what are called open primitives. So that means building pieces that you know you can use flexibly in adaptable ways for whatever scenario you encounter in the future. So you want to be able to design freely. They're environmentally agnostic, specific to wherever it is that they're built. Sometimes it's not completely environmentally agnostic, but that's what you aspire to, right? Protocols can't keep you tied to them. And protocols are also emergent. And the emergent quality of protocols is the fact that they have this forkability. You can adapt them to the circumstance that you're trying to operate inside of. And that's something that is highly advantageous when it comes to protocols and working within protocols themselves. So this is all great, right? Having all of this stuff accessible to you, being able to operate within a protocol framework and sort of stacking things together and operating off of that basis. But the reality is you kind of need something that brings all that stuff together, because as you have all these tools developed and as you have this high degree of forkability, you also have fragmentation of all of the tools and utilities that are available in the market. So you kind of need some things that kind of bring that together. And that's another thing that we kind of think needs to be built. So Web2 open source also had a compensation problem. That's a problem that we've seen. And it's something that I don't think Web3 has necessarily solved. There are a few people who are working in that direction, but it's not really solved yet. But the idea that devs who put a ton of work into things should be compensated for the effort that's put into it. Sometimes this is done at the protocol level with like a token distribution or something along those lines, but the reality is on an ongoing basis, as code becomes useful, it's not necessarily given a degree of a compensation equivalent to its value. And you see a lot of people in Web2 who set up pieces of the stack that other people rely on, never got compensated for it, are still maintaining it out of a passion project. We really want to change that in Web3, right? So that's another part that's a really important trend to pull in. Therefore, as I mentioned, right? If you have all of these different pieces of the stack, you want to be able to have something that brings all these fragmented pieces together. And this is something that we worked on when it comes to DataHub. You want to be able to bring together all of the Web3 needs into one place where people can actually use them. So in contrast to what I said, right, you want to operate with protocols, not platforms. We built a platform. We built a platform to aggregate pieces of the stack. So since Web3 is evolving, so is the technology stack. That means each piece of that modular stack is changing constantly. And you need to be able to switch these things in and out. And so you want people who are doing the work of taking all of those pieces, making them presentable to developers so that they can take the pieces themselves and use them at will. Otherwise, they have to go out and do that research themselves. They don't have a high flexibility of implementation interaction between the pieces. And it's a very useful role to play in the market. So we worked very hard to do that. So our approach to it was to have all of the different services that we can integrate, right? The smart contract platform, storage services, indexing services, and app-specific services available to developers within a native environment for them to operate outside of. So this was our approach. This is also something that we think should be done more generally. I think it's a trend that should exist broadly across the market, and it is something that we push for ourselves. We ourselves, right, we focused on protocol diversity and dev tooling. And that's something that I think, as we're pointing out with the rest of the market, has not necessarily been the case when it comes to tool aggregation. So this is a trend I would like to see. As much as this may look like kind of like a Figment shilling slide, and it somewhat is, the reality is I just want everyone up in this corner. That's really what I would like. I would like people to be pushing in the direction of diversity. I would like people to be pushing in the direction of building good dev tooling so people can interact with the open environment a lot more. So building with tooling aggregators allows you to build all the different pieces of the Web3 stack so that people can flexibly build what it is that they want to build very quickly, iterate quickly, and find adoption a lot more quickly. And that's how we'll move towards this hope of the next billion users in Web3. Without good tooling aggregation, you don't have that. People have to fish for a long time. They have to find the right tools. It's all done through a social mechanism. Tooling aggregation is a strong way forward. So where do we go from here? Realistically, we're in the open stages of Web3 adoption. We're still very much in a builder market. People like to sell this idea that we're going to enter the adoption phase very soon, but the primitives are still being built. So earlier in this presentation, all of the things that I talked about, right, these questions about how is it that you build an adaptable framework, how is it that you increase optionality, and specifically, how do you build open primitives? We don't have open primitives settled just yet. So the important thing that we have to do is focus on building open primitives, giving people availability to utilizing those primitives, and seeing whether or not they work in implementation. And that's what the future of Web3 really could be. So in that same direction, what you want to do is you want to have people on the market who are building for that kind of availability. And without that availability, we're not going to see the degree of adoption that we're looking for across the entire market. So that's my presentation. And I would love to offer you all some time to ask some questions about that and how it is that we approached it, and if you have any questions in that direction.
Yeah, I know it's the morning and it's a bit tough.
I like to think they were floored by my presentation. That's really what it is. They're speechless.
Yeah. So maybe, yeah, I do have a question. So you talked about diversity in terms of how tooling need to assess multiple protocols, for example. How you can take this decision, as you know, that maybe it will defocus your team to maybe add diversity in your tooling, and you have the trade-off of being more performant in the use case you have now versus adding more diversity in your tooling.
That's a great question, because that's a problem we ran into, right? We focused exclusively on one platform for a really long time, and it was very much also to our detriment. So specializing in a particular environment also has the trade-off of meaning that you can't adapt to other trends in the market. So I don't know, it's kind of an opposite answer to what it is you asked, but the reality is you kind of want to be able to do somewhere in the middle. There's also something that is a hugely important trend in Web3, which I really hope to see people doing, which is open collaboration. So you can focus on a single platform and be willing to work with other people in the market. Not a lot of people are willing to do that because they're still using a Web2 mentality. A Web3 mentality is a lot more open, a lot more collaborative, builds stronger relationships, and will move us towards this state where what we're working on is something we all need, rather than what we're working on is something that we're trying to sell to each other.
Thanks.
Yeah, realistically, that is the truth, right? Like, we're selling a vision as much as it is that we're selling something that is a useful tool. And changing that mindset of this like capitalist money grab is going to be part of what it's going to take to get people to really move into this next stage of how it is you can use the internet. A sovereignty-focused internet is not exclusively about financial sovereignty. It's also about the flexibility of implementation. It's also about the flexibility of expression. And it's also about the flexibility of how it is that you, as an individual in the market, can function. Yeah, it's hard to get people to change that mindset, but that's kind of like the what's the term I'm looking for here? It's the abundance mindset, right? You want to go from a perspective of saying there is a lot available, there's a lot of optionality. Success can be collaborative. Cool. Well, I really appreciate all of you coming here to listen to me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.